Greetings sailors, and welcome to a look at a fairly recent premium, the Siliwangi, and this one, as with the London, was provided by Wargaming. I'm not sure if this is still on sale at this point, but this was one of the 3 Chinese Lunar New Year premiums. The other 2 being fairly straight clones of ships from other tech trees. And although this is very similar looking to the Ognevoi, having looked at the actual provenance of the ship, it is not technically an Ognevoi. It's got the same turret layout, but it is in fact a later design that was based on the Ognevoi. I can't remember the class name. It was something like the Scotty class, or, well, that's probably pronounced horribly wrong, but it was something like that. And so, although it does have that resemblance, it isn't the same ship, and unlike Wukong and Baji, where they have somewhat superficial differences in terms of stats. I mean, with the Baji, for instance, it's got slightly better Sigma, but a slightly worse reload. This ship is... it's a tricky one to love. There might be some people out there that have bought this and find it absolutely amazing, but having been given it to play by Wargaming, I'm not one of them. Personally, I found it a miserable faceache of an experience to play. This also comes at an interesting time in that I have just unlocked the Ognevoi over on my NA account, and ostensibly the guns are more or less the same. I think this has the same guns as the stock Ognevoi hull, but there are a fair few differences between them. Some of them are good. It's got quite a good health pool, for instance, with the skill whose name I can't remember. You can get it up to 20,000, as you can see here, and it's also got the same good 130mm guns that the Ognevoi has, albeit in a slightly awkward arrangement. You know, if you get one of these turrets knocked out, you've lost half your firepower in one go. It's got better stealth than the Ognevoi by 200 meters. It's 5.9, which is not, again, amazing, but 5.9 is certainly welcome when you're top tier. There's plenty of stuff that you can outspot. Although compared to the Ognevoi 6.1, the list of ships that you can outspot with that extra 200 meters probably isn't huge. And lastly, and the biggest positive thing about this ship, is that it has the same hydro that Luoyang does, which has a 5.5 spotting radius for enemy ships. That's about where the good news ends, however, because aside from the somewhat awkward firepower arrangement that Ognevoi also shares, it has a whole host of stats that are rather worse than Ognevoi, in addition to also having deep water torps with all of the potential weaknesses that implies. Well, not potential weaknesses. You can't torp other destroyers, basically. So although you've got that hydro, you cannot, unlike Luoyang, get into place and hydro someone and comfortably gun them down with the same rate of fire, or else put torpedoes into smoke where they might be hiding. So it's a real mixed bag, and personally, having now played a couple of battles in the Ognevoi, not a huge number, but I can see the weaknesses of it, but also it has a very good torp reload for the quintuple tubes of the top hull. In fact, if you look at it on a per tube basis, it's 18 point something seconds, which is really good for a destroyer at tier 8. Everyone else is around 22, 23, 24. Then you've got things like Shima at tier 10, which have a 30-second reload, but of course, being a tier 10, you have the extra slot to put in upgrades that considerably improve that, and of course you also get the legendary upgrade. This being a tier 8 doesn't have access to that, so the torp reload ends up being one of the most frustrating features, because as with the Ognevoi being a torp-reliant ship, it really is feast or famine. And anyone that's played, you know, a Shima or an Asashio knows that some games you do really well and other games you really don't. This game, by the way, was demonstrating the absolutely reasonably bad AA for the tier. Not uniquely bad, there are other ships that have bad AA at tier 8, the Asashio being one of them. It's actually worse than this. But compared to the Ognevoi, it's pretty terrible. It's around what you'd expect to find a decent AA on a tier 6 destroyer, maybe a tier 7 destroyer. So to find a tier 8 when you can see tier 10 carriers is absolutely not welcome. And when you get games like that first one, where not only was there radar in play, and I wasn't able to use a speed boost because I don't have a speed boost, which is another one of the things this ship lacks, you don't really have any hope of doing anything. You know, that was just a complete waste of time. We unsurprisingly went on to lose that match, and honestly, I was just glad to be out of it at that point, because, I mean, 2 carriers in any destroyer is always going to be a bit painful, but 2 carriers when you have really crap AA is especially painful. But at least you have smoke. At least you're not a French destroyer or one of the upcoming pan-European ones which don't have smoke. Although they do have better AA, so, you know, it's a mixed bag. Now in this game, this is just going to be a clip really. This was a real ruffle stomp of the enemy team. I managed to land a couple of torp hits on this Bismarck. The range, like the Ognevoi, is 10 kilometers. The torps are actually a bit better. They do a bit more damage. It really is just the reload that lets you down. It's over 2 minutes. It's a good... It's like 38, 40 seconds worse than the Ognevoi. And as I've said, the Ognevoi has a really good reload for having quintuple tubes. This has a bad reload for having these tubes at this tier, because there's really no way to buff it except by taking captain skills. And so if you miss, you have a really long wait. At least with the Asashio, you have the top preload booster. You have that option of, okay, there's a tasty looking target there, I can dump out some extra torps. In my opinion, this ship would have been a really good candidate for a torpedo reload booster. But again, you don't have it, you don't have the option of it. You don't have, as I've said, you don't have the speed boost. You also don't have the heal that Ognevoi has. And Ognevoi can also, in place of its speed boost, take a defensive, which is another thing this thing cannot use. Although I don't think a defensive would be that much use on it anyway, because the mid and short range, in fact I think it's just mid range on this, is the DPS is worse, and it doesn't have the flak of the long range guns that Ognevoi can put out. It doesn't have dual purpose main batteries, even though they're the same guns, so that's a bit weird. We are about to get to see this Hydro in action though. As I've said, that the reload isn't amazing, or have I said that already? It's the same 5-second reload. It's okay. It's not bad. So there are Japanese destroyers, of course, that have worse reloads than that, but they tend to hit a bit harder. This does, however, have the good arcs that the Soviet 130mm guns get. It's just... it feels a bit underwhelming. Especially as your turret traverse is over twice as long as the Ognevoi. That's one of the few other things that is good about the Ognevoi. It's that reload and the turret traverse. It's 9 seconds, which is really good, again, for a Soviet destroyer. This has got a much more pedestrian 18.4 seconds, something like that. So using that Hydro offensively is a lot harder unless you have some actual backup with you that you know will be also firing at what you can spot. And as this is one of the few good things about this ship, it probably is highly worth buying the special upgrade that extends the action time of your Hydro, which I didn't have when I was testing this. But it would have been a good thing to mount, certainly. Because it's one of the few very good things about this ship, quite honestly. I mean, even the hit point pool, which seems impressive at first glance, is a lot less impressive when you take into consideration ships like the Kid or the Ognevoi, which when you have used all your heals, I think in the case of the Ognevoi, it can get back at, it's like about 25,000 effective, something like that. So, you know, even just having the heal that the Ognevoi had would have been nice on this ship. But as it is, you pay a lot for that Hydro, and I think you pay more than you really needed to. Especially with just how sluggish overall this ship is. I mean, Ognevoi itself isn't known for being fantastically nimble. This has a worse turning radius, although a slightly better rudder shift. It's 0.8 seconds better. But I think the real main thing that makes it feel particularly sluggish is that lack of speed boost, especially when you're trying to run away from somebody. It's not fun. You know, Sierra Mike flag will get you to just over 38 knots, but there are plenty of people that will be able to run you down. And you can't do a blessed thing about it. And it also means when you're trying to maneuver, you bleed off speed like nobody's business, which is obviously in most other destroyers mitigated by being able to pop the speed boost. So when you're trying to maneuver at, say, 31, 32 knots, you're down to cruiser speeds. Well, cruiser going to straight line speeds, and for a destroyer that's really not particularly fast at all. So yeah, it just feels quite unpleasant on top of everything else. But really the main drag for me with this ship is that torp reload. You know, it really does come down to that. They could have given this something to make it a bit more effective in other areas, but it's just, if you call it wrong, if somebody uses WASD hacks, then you're going to have a real bad time. There's not a lot you can do about it except sit twiddling your thumbs for in excess of 2 minutes. It's almost tempting to deliberately take some damage so that your adrenaline rush can, of course, bring that down a bit. So yeah, this has a whole host of things going against it. It's a really hard ship to recommend. If you are particularly confident with using torpedoes and don't mind the rather uncomfortable, at times frustrating amount of time that you have to spend in between torp reloads, then you can probably do effective things with this ship. The torps do hit for a pretty decent amount of damage for the tier, and because they're deep water torps, of course, they only have, I think, 800 meters of detection as opposed to the 1.2, 1.4 that you find on other destroyers. But as somebody who isn't maybe the best person at torpedo destroyers myself, I really struggled with these. In Ognevoi, I've already had a couple of 100k plus games just because of that ability to put out lots of torpedoes. And the same with the Asashio, which nominally has as bad a reload in terms of the number of tubes you have and the number of launchers you have versus the actual reload you have. That at least has got the torp reload booster, and it's got the speed boost as well. The only way in which it is considerably worse than this is in terms of both its rate of fire and of course its AA, which is pretty garbage. But even then, you know, the Sashio with its 127mm guns, it's still the Japanese 127mm HE, which does hit hard. And if you had spec'd into gun skills, gunboat Sashio is a thing for some people, then I don't know, you know, I'm not sure I would honestly necessarily say it's a particularly even cut thing between the two. I think it would be quite close. It would really come down to player skill and how much health people were going into a particular situation with. So that target, I could tell I really wasn't expecting them to be there. In the Ognevoi, I'd have been spotted that little bit further away, but in the Ognevoi, I'd have been able to pop a speed boost, and I'd have still had the option of smoke. So yeah. Oh, and I'd have been able to heal back something from that hit as well. So that's fun. In terms of what I did for Captain Spec for this, I'll maybe show that at the end, but it wasn't anything too special. I think I used my Gajimada Captain, which is 15 points. I don't have any 19-point destroyer captains on the Pan-Asian line. And this almost ends up being one of those premiums that needs its own captain just to take account of the peculiarities and the deficiencies of the ship. Certainly torpedo reload, that one, expert, I can't remember what it's called now. Is it just torpedo expert? I can't remember. The one that gives you the extra bit of torpedo reload buff, that would probably be a pretty strong pick. You certainly want the extra hit points. You certainly want BFT for the extra rate of fire. You could take Vigilance, which would enhance your Hydro a little bit, but only in terms of spotting torpedoes, so I would say that one's a fairly low priority. And there's other things you could take, like IFHE, but of the 4th rank skills, I think only Concealment Expert is what you would consider mandatory. So yeah, it's kind of a hard ship to particularly recommend. I really had a frustrating, miserable time playing this fairly often, and there's a reason why I've got this odd hodgepodge of replays for this particular video, to try and show off bits of different things, quite how bad it is at AA, quite how useful the Hydro can be sometimes. In fact, I think there was another match where I was with a destroyer able to go in and use that Hydro offensively and take care of... It was like a Shenyang or something. It was somebody that couldn't torp me back, and they really couldn't do anything about it. So there are situations when it can be quite powerful, but equally the Lo Yang would be as good, if not better, because it's got a bit of extra stealth, it's got smoke, it's got speed boost, and it has a much faster rate of fire on those guns. The part where these guns become superior over that of the Lo Yang is at longer ranges, where those Soviet ballistics really do come into play, and especially having the better pen on the AP shells can be useful against some of the more lightly armoured cruisers that you will encounter. But overall, I would rather play Lo Yang than this, no question about it. I would rather play an Ognevoi than this. There's just too much potential frustration in this ship for me to say it's in any way good. It's one of those ships that you have to really want the challenge. You have to, as I've said, be particularly confident with your torpedo destroyers and your ability to predict people manoeuvring. At least it doesn't have the super deep water torps of a Sashio. At least I can do things like hit that Atago. But with the Lo Yang, they're just regular torps, so you don't even have that limitation. Although, that said, I never had that much success with Lo Yang's torps. They are rather slower than this. This does at least have 62 knot torps. It's kind of medium speed torps, and you can get that up to 65 knots with the new consumable that the new module that gives you the extra 10%. So there's that. If they were as slow as the Lo Yang and the Ognevoi at 56 knots, then it would be a bit more painful considering all of the other stats. But like I've said, the Ognevoi, I've had good games just because of that ability to put out a fairly higher number of torps. So, sometimes quantity has a better quality than the actual innate ability of the individual torpedo to do damage. It's not the individual torpedoes that are scary on the Benham. It's the Benham's ability to put out so many of them and to reload so quickly. It's not the ability to put out torpedoes quickly overall that makes the Asashio scary. It's the ability to put out a burst of them, and it's the ability to put out 20-kilometer torpedoes that have very low visibility. This doesn't really have anything like that. It's only got the Hydro, and the Lo Yang already does that. It's not like the London versus the Devonshire, for instance, where you're giving up something for a very clear something else. Even though, in my opinion, as I said in that video, the London maybe gives up a little bit too much. So I'm not really sure what they were thinking with this ship, to be honest. Broadly speaking, it just comes off as a worse Lo Yang. I keep doing that. A worse Ognevoi. Even though it's not technically an Ognevoi, it shares enough of the same characteristics that, it's kinda the same, but not. I mean, at least it's a ship that actually existed. It's not like the Wukong and the Baji, where it's straight up fantasy nonsense on a par with the ARP ships or the HSF ships, for example. This really did exist. It's named after a famous Javanese king. Therefore makes sense as to why you would choose it for an Indonesian Navy ship. But as an actual ship to play, it doesn't really live up to the the namesake that it's got, and it just, for the most part, ended up being quite a frustrating experience. And ships like the Asashio and the Shima and other Japanese torpedo-dependent destroyers can also end up being a very frustrating experience for the same reason. If people just don't sail nicely into your torpedoes, then you can end up not being able to do very much. But for the most part, they don't suffer with quite this reload. This really is an exceptionally bad reload for the tier. So this isn't going to be a win. It was one of my better damage games, but it's only been down to a couple of torpedoes hit. You can't even, even in the old days, this would have not been good. You can't even stack flooding very reliably because just you have that long reload. If you were staggering your drops, perhaps, then maybe. But by the time they've spread out towards the end of that 10 kilometers, you're not, like, they don't have the punch of the Asashio torps. If they did, maybe it would be a bit more palatable. I've said they're good for the tier, and they are. Ognevoi gets 15k ish, and this has over 17, it's like 17 and a half, something like that. But if it was closer to the 21,000 of those really hard-hitting Japanese torps, then maybe you could say it felt like it was worth the wait. But it really doesn't. So if they'd done something a bit different, if they'd given the torps, say, a longer range, 12 kilometers perhaps, and that way you could have put on torp acceleration a bit more comfortably, or even 15, like the is it the Yodachi? I can't remember which one they gave the 15 but fairly slow torps to. But as it is, it doesn't really have anything that you can do with it beyond try and hit people with torps as you would in a Japanese destroyer, and hope they don't use WAS attacks, and hope there isn't a carrier sent to make your day miserable. I could have tried to make a getaway before this from the smoke, of course, but there was carrier planes buzzing around, so I knew it was doomed anyway. The match was doomed anyway, so what else was I going to do except hang around and hope I could get my torps back in time to at least get a bit more damage. So in my hands, yeah, I really haven't enjoyed this. I've struggled to make an impact. And even compared to the Ognevoi, I had a fairly dreadful experience. It's not like the Ognevoi has a great reputation. Personally, I would recommend this even further down than the Irian. I think in most people's experiences, this is not going to be a fun ship to play. And I can't really recommend it, but if you fancy a challenge, I suppose. It's got fairly hard-hitting deep water torps, so, if you know what you're doing particularly well with torpedo destroyers and you've used the deep water torps before, then you might have some better idea what you're doing with it. But just over the several hours I've spent playing this ship, I've just found nothing but a determination to never want to play it again, pretty much. There are ships that do what this does better, and you don't have to pay for the privilege of them. So, yeah, in my opinion, it's not a good premium ship, but somebody somewhere might find it fun, I suppose. So that's it for this look at the Siliwangi. Hopefully you found it useful, and if you did, you can do all the usual things down underneath the video. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.